So the big picture here is that fructose can get converted to uric acid through this pathway if there's excessive amounts of ATP depletion, you've got excessive amounts of movement through the step, you're not properly repleting, converting that ADP back to ATP, whether it's here or through the other steps of glycolysis. So in that situation, you get fructose being converted all the way down these pathways through to uric acid. And this is the focus generally from David Perlmutter and Rick Johnson. And so what we'll talk about next is the situations where this happens. And as we said, they tend not to be particularly relevant to how humans might eat.
Yeah.
How us as humans typically eat. So there was a meta-analysis done to consider all the studies looking at fructose and when it does and doesn't increase uric acid. And so I'm going to share some quotes here that describe a lot of what we've been discussing. So the title of the study is "The Effects of Fructose Intake on Serum Uric Acid Vary Among Controlled Dietary Trials." And so they state that there's concern that dietary fructose may increase uric acid concentrations. To assess the effects of fructose on serum uric acid concentrations in people with and without diabetes, we conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis of controlled feeding trials. And so here's what they found. They state that isocaloric exchange of fructose for other carbohydrate did not affect serum uric acid in diabetic and non-diabetic participants, with no evidence of interstudy heterogeneity, meaning that it was homogeneous, so everybody had basically the same response here. There's not a question of maybe individuality between the studies. And they then state that hypercaloric supplementation of controlled diets with fructose at 35% excess energy at extreme doses of 213 to 219 grams per day significantly increased serum uric acid compared with the controlled diets alone in non-diabetic participants, with no evidence of heterogeneity. Confounding from excess energy cannot be ruled out in the hypercaloric trials. These analyses do not support a uric acid increasing effect of isocaloric fructose intake in non-diabetic and diabetic participants. Hypercaloric fructose intake may, however, increase uric acid concentrations. So in a second, I'll be digging into those studies in a little bit more detail, the ones that included the excessive amounts of fructose. But again, just to highlight, so what they said was that in both diabetic and non-diabetic participants, replacing fructose for other carbohydrates had no effect on serum uric acid in all of the studies that they looked at. The only situation where fructose was increasing uric acid was in hypercaloric supplementation of controlled diets. So someone's already eating a regular diet, and I'll get to that in a second, and then adding 35% of their calories that they were already eating, so a total of 135% of what they would have eaten on their control diet from pure fructose, from fructose-sweetened beverages. And in that case, which was an extra 213 to 219 grams of pure fructose, that increased serum uric acid. And this was in non-diabetic participants. And so they state this in a little more detail where they say that the 3 hypercaloric trials in this meta-analysis fed fructose at 35% excess energy, which was 850 to 870 calories or 213 to 219 grams, in fluid form in non-diabetic males for 1 week, a level of exposure that is more than double the 95th percentile of fructose intake in the United States. And then I looked at those studies that included the hypercaloric fructose feeding studies and found a couple other details. And that's basically looking at what the diet was. And so that 35% calories of fructose was a 20% fructose sweetened solution. So they're just drinking very, very concentrated solution of fructose. And again, this is 35% more than they would normally be eating, which is a huge amount. And that was on top of a controlled diet that already had 55% of its calories from carbohydrates and contained 11% of those carbohydrates as sugar. Another interesting piece is that in this study, they limited leisurely sports activity to less than 1 hour per week. So basically, they weren't allowed to be active during this time because that would confound the studies. So they're eating an already high carb diet with some amount of sugar, and then adding it's a huge fructose overfeeding study with solely fructose. And that is the only context looking at, this was a meta-analysis of all the studies looking at fructose in place of other carbohydrates. And this was the only situation where they actually found it to increase uric acid levels.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have a couple studies here that look at similar situations. So, and this is characteristic of most of the research in humans around fructose. So I have another study here essentially looking at the effects with ATP homeostasis inside diabetics. So essentially what I wanted to point out here is we're looking at what types of people that they're looking at. So the people who were eligible were between the ages of 45 and 76 years old, had type 2 diabetes, had a body mass index greater than 25, and were able to complete a maximal exercise test. So they were, first of all, we have people who are overweight, and so this is kind of their breakdown overall. Their normal dietary fructose intake. So these are the people who completed here, was about 17 grams per day usually. They usually ate 1,500 calories per day. And then here's we have their serum uric acid, and they were clearly overweight. And most of them were on drugs for diabetes. So
and Mike, this was an individual study, or this was a review?
This is an individual study.
So what you're describing right now is just a study where they were looking at fructose's impact on uric acid, and you're just saying that they were doing it in largely diabetic overweight.
Exactly. But furthermore, besides doing it, so I'm pulling out the studies that even in the meta-analysis, they reference some of these studies. So there's quite a few of these. And what they talk about here is that after an overnight fast, they infused, 250 milligrams per kilogram of body weight fructose. They infused it over 30 to 60 seconds. So at my current body weight at 200 pounds, 250 milligrams per kilogram would give me about a 23 gram bolus of intravenous fructose in a minute. So, and then what they basically saw from this study is that they depleted hepatic ATP content. And so my point in sharing this is that in a lot of these studies, another study they looked at a 75 gram bolus fructose, like oral drink in 5 minutes. So what happens in a lot of these studies is, particularly for an intravenous study, you never will see that level of fructose in the bloodstream ever.
Yeah.
The liver takes all of the fructose that you get from gut absorption, and the other thing is your gut will parse or slowly drip the amount of carbohydrate that you'll be absorbing from your diet over time. So it'll adjust its influx. So an intravenous dose or things like that, yes, you see ATP depletion. Of course you will, because you have a massive bolus of fructose intravenously. And then in the oral dosing studies, again, like I discussed previously, in order to get 75 grams of fructose in an oral bolus in normal consumption patterns, you'd have to have at least or around 150 grams of carbohydrate. So what you're essentially saying here is, I'm going to slam 150 grams of carbohydrate at one time, or in this case, 75 grams of fructose. That doesn't count for any type of malabsorption or intolerance, etc. And yes, you're going to see metabolic perturbation. So in these circumstances, you will see ATP depletion in the liver, no problem. There's no question about that. There's no argument about that in any place. But the question is, do any of these situations mirror real life? And the answer is no. So what you wind up seeing is, there's a couple other studies that they talk about.
Real quick, Mike, just because you were talking about the injection ones. So just for reference, in terms of glucose, which you always have glucose in the blood, you don't normally have very much fructose. In terms of glucose, if you have a low blood sugar of, let's say, 80 milligrams per deciliter, then you're normally having about 4 grams of glucose in your blood at that time. If you eat a super huge, very carbohydrate rich, easily digested meal and doubled that to a blood sugar of 160 milligrams per deciliter, which is high after a meal, depending on what it was, but talking a big, very carbohydrate dense meal, then you would have 8 grams of sugar in your blood. And the study you're talking about, as you said, would be injecting as much as 20 grams of fructose. Yeah, 23 for someone who's 200 pounds. Grams of fructose into the blood directly, which is incredibly high. I mean, we normally have very, very little fructose. We have way more glucose than fructose in the blood. And even if you were adding that much glucose, I mean, that would be the equivalent of, oh man, what would it be? So 20 grams would be 400 milligrams per deciliter. Is that right?
So if you're at 80, so you want to get to 20, you have to be by 5. So yeah, 400.
Yeah. So adding, the equivalent amount of glucose would be putting your blood sugar at a level of 400 milligrams per deciliter, which even you have to be very, very extremely diabetic to hit anything near that. So yeah, this is not at all related to a physiologic.
Not to mention
context.
that the population that they tested this in was diabetic, and they were using metformin. Almost 50% of them were using metformin, and 50% of them were using, I can't even pronounce the name of the drug, thiazolidinediones. So they were using other diabetic drugs. Mm-hmm. So you already have it. You're taking an impaired population and injecting them with a ridiculous amount of fructose, and then wondering why they had, or basically saying, look, here we have hepatic ATP depletion. It's yes, you're going to have hepatic ATP depletion, especially in diabetics. It's like, that's not even a question. So, yeah, there's a couple other studies that I went through specifically, and that the review talks about, because I wanted to see, like, what are we looking at in this research in humans for fructose and ATP depletion. And again, there's different situations. So you have a situation where you have ATP depletion, which is where the fructose is rapidly entering the liver. It's undergoing fructolysis, and then you're using up that ATP really fast because you have such a massive dose. So like the 23 grams IV. Other situations like a 75-gram bolus, and then the other thing after that is if you have ATP depletion, then the next studies are you looking at uric, like what happens with uric acid? So as far as the and the uric acid piece comes in through that step that we talked about, where you start moving the ADP to AMP to inosine and adenosine, and then those get converted to uric acid through some of the nucleosidase enzymes, and then xanthine oxidase or xanthine dehydrogenase. So the first problem is you have these massive boluses with all of those situations. The next problem is, or the next thing that they say is in this review, they say, however, it was recently reported that ingestion of larger amounts of fructose failed to acutely increase uric acid concentration when ingested in split doses throughout several days, suggesting that liver ATP depletion is unlikely to occur with usual patterns of sugar consumption. So we have research looking at, okay, what if we split these doses up over time? And we see, okay, well, that's not really a problem. The other thing that we talk about is if you have like a metabolic syndrome, does that increase your probability of having this uric acid problem? And again, that goes back to having this backup of energy metabolism, right? So you have your glycolysis already backed up. So the way they look at this is they can look at if in type 2 diabetics or people who are overweight. And what they then turn around and say in the research is, Lin et al. Observed that fructose consumption resulted in higher serum uric acid in individuals with a BMI greater than 30 kilograms per meter squared. Interestingly, their studies show that there was no effect of fructose intake in subjects with a BMI between 25 and 29 kilograms per meter squared, although serum uric acid showed a trend to be elevated depending on body weight status. Moreover, the blood samples were drawn after an overnight fast in the morning, ruling out any postprandial effects of fructose ingestion. Additionally, the effect on serum uric acid was more likely to be secondary to obesity or metabolic syndrome than fructose consumption per se. So now what we're seeing is that being in metabolic syndrome and then throwing in large boluses of fructose is likely to increase uric acid, most likely because of the context of that backed up metabolism, and less so because there's like fructose is inherently a problem. You already have a metabolic problem, and then you're throwing fructose into the system, and it may exacerbate issues, especially in larger boluses. And again, I want to preface again the context here. In all of these studies, we're talking about free fructose. We're not talking about they're giving people orange juice, which is a very different scenario overall.
Right. Yeah. 100%. And again, the difference you're alluding to there is that orange juice would have equal amounts of fructose to glucose, more or less. There's also other factors like the polyphenols and vitamin C in there that help to deal with uric acid, but we'll get there later. But yeah, very different. Even fruit juice, which according to people like Perlmutter and Rick Johnson, I've heard them say that, you might as well just be like drinking straight fructose. It's the same thing, it's the same as drinking soda. Like, avoid fruit juice for sure is their recommendation. And of course, Robert Lustig as well.
Well, and there's also a study here looking at what happens if it's fructose and glucose compared to just fructose. And what they wind up saying here is, so I'll just read it here. So Akhavan and Anderson tested solutions containing different ratios of glucose and fructose. And their study, overnight fasted men receive a standardized breakfast in the morning. At 4 hours later, a 300 kilocalorie drink was ingested within 3 minutes. The solutions were sweetened with either high fructose corn syrup containing 55% of fructose, sucrose, or the monosaccharide forms of glucose and fructose in specific ratios. So there was an 80% glucose, 20% fructose. There was a 50-50, which was sucrose. There was a 35% glucose, 65% fructose. And then there was a 20% glucose, 80% fructose. At 75 minutes, uric acid concentrations were highest after the 20% glucose and 80% fructose drink. The sucrose and the 50% fructose and 50% glucose solutions each resulted in significantly lower uric acid concentrations than did the 20% glucose, 80% fructose solutions, but they did not differ significantly from any of the other solutions. The uric acid area under the curve did not differ significantly after the glucose 35 and glucose 35, fructose 65, glucose 50, fructose 50, and sucrose solutions. In other research, only a weak response of serum uric acid to fructose was found. So in layman's terms, or in, I guess, more simple terms, because it could have been a little confusing there, but essentially only in the solution that was 20% glucose, 80% fructose, did you see a higher serum uric acid concentration, or that was the highest. But when you add 50% fructose and 50% glucose solution, there was significantly lower uric acid concentration overall, and it did not differ significantly from other solutions. And then the uric acid area under the curve did not differ significantly. So essentially what you're seeing is that if you have glucose present with fructose, which is, again, this is the normal consumption pattern. You don't get people having 100 grams of fructose in a bolus in a drink and taking it in 30 seconds or 2 minutes. That's not what happens for most people. And even if you're having high fructose corn syrup, which is only 55% fructose, you still, again, that's very close to the 50-50. We're not seeing this massive difference. So it's hard to even pin it on high fructose corn syrup. It's more of a question of, in these studies, like where you're not getting this straight bolus of fructose. And if you put glucose with it, you get an entirely different result. If you space out consumption, you get an entirely different result. And you wouldn't be able to hit these dosages of fructose in the studies anyway. So it's like the way it's being, the other thing is you're not injecting fructose in your veins either. So in all of these situations, it's like, let's test this extreme context. And then we're going to make these extensions about how terrible fructose is. And then look at some types of epidemiologic research and see people who have soft drinks have X outcome. And it's probably because of the fructose, because of these extreme studies. It's a very, that doesn't take the context into focus at all. And there's some historical stuff that we can talk about as well. But go ahead, Jay.
Yeah. There's a lot more to dig into. It's like, if that's the line, if that's the threshold we're using to define something as a poison, like it's meaningless, right? I mean, at that point, water, if you drink all of the day's worth of water in like 2 minutes, depending if you're drinking, an ounce per pound or more, whatever, you can drown. And so water is obviously a poison as well. And I mean, it's just absurd to pull out of these contexts and then make a claim that fructose itself on its own is that is the problem. Let alone, and it is the driver as well, let alone just something that's added to a poor context in ridiculous amounts.
If you enjoyed that clip, you'll definitely want to download the free Energy Balance Food Guide. The Energy Balance Food Guide will help you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy, and so much more. The food guide makes it extremely easy to get started with a bioenergetic approach to optimizing your health. So head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide.